which I'm not going to go through each and every single one of those, but we are going to do an overview of the kings. I know there's a lot of different supporting text out of the Chronicles that back all of these up, but just for sake of y'all's sanity and my own preparing this, we're going to stick with 1st and 2nd Kings and do basically a flyover and look at the whole purpose of this series in the first place, at least what I've gathered in my study. But first, I have to tell you about David Hamilton. Most of y'all, or at least a lot of y'all, I think, know him. He works with me at Pollard Children's Home. He does the same thing. We drive around and we pick up commodities in a truck, and he has this tool bag. And it's his tool bag. It has all of his straps, all of his brackets in there, and they're organized in a very special way. And he let me use it on my last route. And he said, now, when I get this back, it better be organized the same way that it was when I gave it to you. And I thought, no problem. And I had this idea. When I got back, I brought his bag inside, and I was going to go through and organize it just the way that he had it before. But then I had an idea. What if I could organize it even better? And so I did all this research, and I found 2 different fancy knots. I mean, they're like Cub Scout or Eagle Scouts knots. I mean, they're just very fancy. And I thought, I'm going to tie all of his brackets together with this fancy knot. And I had it done in such a way that there's a pin right in the middle of the knot. So you pull that pin, and it just releases everything, and then he'd be able to get everything that he needs, and it keeps them all together. And I did a couple other fancy knots around some of his bungee cords, and I got all color-coded the same ones together. And then I zipped his bag up, and then I put it in his office, and I thought he was going to open it up and be like, wow, this is amazing. And so I listened. I was standing up in my office, I'm like listening for him, see if he'd open up that bag, and I heard him unzip it, and then he goes under his breath, but I heard it. He goes, what on earth? And looked in there, and I was like, oh, no. So I should have just gone back and just did it the way that he wanted me to, which I knew how to. So I went back in there and started apologizing. I was like, I'll fix it. I'll do it. He's like, I will get the bag how it needs to be. And I was like, all right. Lesson learned. I kept having this thought when we were going through this class, and I was looking at all of these wicked kings, because that's really what stands out, is when you look at the kings of Israel, the ones that stand out are the wicked ones, because there's more of them than there are the righteous ones. And it's almost like when you got a righteous king, you could come to class, and Dad just did Hezekiah, and it was just like a sweet relief. You go through, and you're like, oh, finally, we have a good king, we have a good righteous person to talk about instead of just Ahab. He did more wicked than any other, Manasseh, going through all these different wicked qualities and then seeing the downward spiral that they just kept on going through. I kept thinking back to, well, what about before the kings? This was sort of a hole that they had dug themselves, and because they weren't even supposed to have kings. And so I want to go back. This is the only verse that's not going to be in 1 Kings or 2 Kings, but it's 1 Samuel 8:20, and we'll talk about the context in just a second. But it says, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, the prophet. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, when you first just read that passage, it's like, oh man, this is a terrible idea, because God didn't want them to have a king. This is not how God wanted them to govern themselves. You had the prophets, you had the judges. But then when you dig into it, it just gets even more sad before we get into all of the different kings. But that's where it began. It began with the voice of all the people saying, we want a king just like everybody else. And so I went into this thinking, we're going to look at all the lessons that we can learn from the righteous kings and the wicked kings, but then a couple other ones began to pop up as well. And so I made a list at the end. We're going to get into just lessons we can learn from all of the kings. I'm sure you could make a better one or a longer one. So feel free to chime in on those. But the context of this is even more tragic. It's Samuel. The reason why they're not listening to Samuel, the reason why they're not happy with how God wants them to govern themselves is because of Samuel's kids. It was Nadab and Abihu. They're offering strange fire. They're incredibly corrupt. And so because of that corruption, again, Samuel's kids, because of that corruption, then they start to cry out, and maybe that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, but they began to cry out, we want a king just like everybody else. We see corruption where there's not supposed to be corruption. We see this great, and godly man, Samuel, but his kids are nothing like him, and if they're going to be the predecessors, we don't want this anymore. We want a king just like everybody else. And so a lesson on parenting came up. And, and I have a little 2-year-old, and right now he's going through the terrible twos, and I'm thinking like, man, this is, a lot of these lessons land very heavy. So anybody who ever says, and I've heard preachers say this before, they're talking about people's attitude towards the Old Testament, it doesn't preach, it's hard to find application. It really isn't. And I think that we've all probably felt that same feeling going through and just looking at these kings. Maybe some of the kings we don't really know too much about, but then once you get into the application going, man, this really lands not only in the church today, but just the world today in general. We can see evidence of this very old truth that God has given us, and that is his plan is better than ours every time. We may not understand it. We may not agree with it because we don't really maybe understand everything about that plan, but it's better. God knows how to organize the tool bag. God knows how to govern his own people, and it's only when we decide that we know better or that we know something that God doesn't know that it can lead to generations of problems. So I'm going to get to the big three, just one slide per, but you had Saul, David, Solomon, those the three pillars, and then everything kind of falls apart once you get into Solomon's reign. But Saul, so we want a king just like everybody else. They find a very kingly looking individual, Saul. He's head and shoulders taller than everybody else. He looks like a king, looks pretty good, but even the tall can fall. Saul did not end up being a very good king at all. We get to David, the best king that Israel had at that point. In fact, he's a Christ type, so Jesus is compared to him, and there will be no better king than David, which is, you already know, when you get to David's life and you start getting that picture, it's going to be a very long ride, because after David, there's a lot of kings that come after him. But David still had those two grenades in his life, Bathsheba, Absalom, and then really after Bathsheba, he becomes this tired king sitting on the throne. If you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, and you got 1 Samuel, you got the highlights of his reign, or opposite. 2 Samuel is the highlight of his reign, but then if you read through 1 Samuel, it's just the whole story of David, his battles that he went through, both his spiritual ones and the physical ones that he had. But then after him, you've got Solomon. Now, look, I could not find a good picture of Solomon. I was trying to type in like intelligent king, and things, and just nothing really was coming up. And so I typed in intelligent person, and the image you see before you is what came up. So I took both of those. But Solomon, he's given this wisdom from above, and God gives him. There's a really cool passage. I wish I'd put it in the PowerPoints, but I believe it's in 2nd Chronicles, and y'all can fact check me. It's easy today. But it says that Solomon was wiser than anyone who came before him and anyone who will ever come after him. And he's got all that wisdom, and even with that wisdom, God's plan is still better than our plan. He didn't want them to have a king. One person should not be ruling over them, and they did it anyway. And so you've got God telling him, no gods, no other gods, no high places. And then you read several times, but in 1 Kings 11 and verse 7, it says, "And then Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem." And as you get towards the end of Solomon's life, you see there's a lot more of those high places that popped up everywhere, and he was swayed by women. So even with all of that wisdom, he was imperfect. And then we see what happens afterwards, which it's comical now only because we're not living through it, but with his son, where in Ecclesiastes he writes, what's the point of all this wealth and all these riches? Because you're going to pass it on to someone else who you have no idea what they're going to do with all of that wealth. And then as you're reading that, you're going, oh, Solomon, your son is going to take all of that wealth, and then he's just going to take the entire train of Israel and then drive it off of a cliff. And that's exactly what happens. The kingdom splits with Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So you have the north and the south, they split. It's Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And I would always get those flipped around, so I believe I do have a slide that has the correct one up there. But after this is where we got into all of those kings that we covered each Wednesday night. And I didn't get to be here for all of them for various reasons, but the ones that I were here for, all the teachers did an excellent job. I don't know if you can tell up on the screen too well, but there's a different shade of blue on the right side of the screen, and those are all of the righteous kings that you have. And it almost doesn't even seem that bad. I mean, obviously Israel, you've got 19 out of 19, all terrible, but then you get to Judah, that remnant tribe, 12 out of 20 of the kings are wicked, But I mean, that's eight righteous kings. It's not horrible. But when you look at the years in between each of those reigns, and then the damage that happened because of the wicked ruler that came before them, a lot of it was just kind of cleanup. They're trying their best to clean up whatever came after that wicked king, and just as they're kind of getting things maybe turned around a little bit or improved in some areas, the next king comes in, and it's just this really sad situation. And so as you go down through all of these, it might just seem most of the names are not any names that we're going to name our kids, unless you just find a cool one up there. I would definitely choose from the blue if I were you, since those are the good ones. But there's a lot of time that goes on in between each of those, a lot of history. And I started to wonder, why would God do that? Why would God record all of those? Why not just summarize all that history and just say, what I have up on one slide? Israel had 19 out of 19 kings were bad, and Judah had 12 out of 20 kings that were wicked. It's not a good thing. You should follow my plan. Next. But why do you think it is that God decided to record each of those and then to give us some information about them? Why not just say he was just as wicked as the guy that came before him? Next. Why do we have so much information about all the evil that they did? Yeah, to learn from it. And
just saw it started off okay, and all the things he did wrong that he didn't always even realize he was doing wrong.
yeah, to learn from it, because we forget. We're a very forgetful people. We pick on the Israelites a lot for that, but we're just as forgetful. We're like, man, they just came out of Egypt and they saw all those miracles that God did, and as soon as they get into the wilderness, they're like, we're going to die of thirst. So God just parted the water right in front of you. Why do you say that? Same thing with Elijah, but we forget so easily, and especially when things aren't going well or when we're uncomfortable. We always forget. And so, yeah. What else?
I think God's kind of putting an exclamation point with every one of those reigns, because at the end of all of them, it said, as a summary of the reign that they did, they sinned according to the sin which Jeroboam the son of Nebat did, which caused Israel to sin. So 19 reigns on that left column end all the same way, or the 18 after that. That they just continued in bad cycles, sin cycles. Those legacies are hard to overcome, to break those sin cycles. And Israel's proof positive.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you definitely have multiple lessons, and a lot of them are negative. Especially when you look at Israel, they're all negative. But you do see, if you're a glass half full kind of person, I guess you do see some positives there. I see the patience of God there. Why not after 6 bad kings? Why not then would God say, all right, you know what, that's it. We've had 6 different kings come through here. They've all been bad. Y'all don't know how to do this. I told you not to have a king in the first place. Now we're going to just go into captivity and we're done with you. But instead, you've got 19 kings. That's a very long time, and so I think it definitely shows the patience of God as well.
Yeah, I think kind of like what Neil was saying, this repeated cycle of idolatry. You're like, okay, this is really emphasized over and over and over. What does it look like, 2,000 years later, where we're still kind of going through the same cycle of idolatry to this and that? And, I think that's just one way of God saying, hey, this is what people are dealing with. You're dealing with the same things with a different package, basically.
Yeah, yep, definitely. If you look at the end of Deuteronomy, so it's when Moses is passing the leadership on to Joshua. And so Joshua has a similar speech as well. And basically at the end of his life, he's saying, you need to follow God's commands. If you follow his law and if you keep on doing what you're supposed to do, then everything is going to go well for you out in the land. And then the people kind of echo back to him, it's like, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to follow God. And then it's repeated. And if you follow God, then everything's going to go out well. Here's the 10 Commandments. Don't forget to follow God, and don't worship any of these foreign gods. And then all the Israelites, before they go into Canaan, they're like, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to follow God. And then they don't. And then Joshua does the same thing. And if you remember what comes after Joshua, it's Judges. So things didn't work out very well for them either. But you have this group of people all saying, we're going to follow God. We're going to do it. And then they don't. And so I think we have these reminders for a reason. It's going to happen. And we have 19 different kings in Israel to prove that point. We've got 12 out of 20 kings that are wicked on Judah's side. So for sure, I think that God puts this not just to be redundant, but just so that he drills that into our heads. Again, new parent here, but I've had to tell Jude the same thing over and over and over and over again. Just like, okay, I think that's going to stick. I think now he knows not to bite people. he will still bite you. So careful. If you pick him up, he will bite. We haven't fixed that yet. I don't really know how to be honest with you. But you have to repeat things over and over again in order to get it for it to stick. But I think sometimes there can be a disconnect when we think, this has happened a long time ago. We don't have a king anymore. That's not our government. We're safe from that. But there's a lot of ways that we do the same thing, where we question God's plan for our life, or we don't have to even say it. It's just when we begin to lose trust in what God's already told us, bad things will happen. And that's a very basic way to summarize what was going on here. Let's see. Well, help. I think I hit something. There we go. All right. So you have the split that takes place after Solomon, the northern kingdom, Israel, the 10 tribes, and then you've got the southern kingdom that splits after that. The northern kingdom of Israel had 19 kings over about 200 years, so that's 930 to 722 BC, until it was conquered by Assyria. And so here's just a breakdown. This is not the entire book of 1 Kings on one slide, but these are kind of the major things that take place in the book. You've got the transition from David to Solomon. There's some drama there. Then you've got Solomon's reign, where he builds the temple. And then after that, you have basically the setup for 2 Kings. And I don't know if this was mentioned in the first class, but 1 and 2 Kings originally was just one work, and then it was split into two later on. I don't really know all the history behind that. We've got Jeroboam in the north, and then you've got Rehoboam in the south. And one of the biggest issues that they had was, well, it's not really a surprise because we saw that from the very beginning. When the Israelites were out in the wilderness, they tended to worship idols, which someone already touched on this a little bit. We still have idol worship today. In the same way, so it's not like we've gotten away just because we don't construct golden calves anymore. But Jeroboam, so the first sign that things are not going to go very well, is he establishes idol worship, and then both kingdoms at the same time experience instability, and then there's conspiracies, there's all of this corruption. Things get really violent, and then you have God trying to get through to these various kings. So as you read through 1 and 2 Kings, it's not just tragedy after tragedy and wicked king after wicked king, but God is still trying to get into their heads and get into their hearts and trying to change their ways. And so he does so in very dramatic ways. You've got Elijah, one of the greatest prophets that ever lived, and then his predecessor, Elisha, is even greater in a lot of ways. He has 3 times the spirit that Elijah has, but he tries to show himself time and time again to all the kings and then to all the surrounding witnesses that could see. One that happens in 1 Kings is you have Elijah, the prophets of Baal. If you remember that whole dramatic account on top of Mount Carmel, where God actually sends fire down from heaven, consumes all the water around the altar. I mean, there's some big things that are happening here in order to try and make the point. Maybe you should listen to God's plan. Maybe you should have done that the entire time. And then you see a lot of stubborn and rebellious people. And I think that the application there can't be missed in our lives as well. God is trying to tell us. He got this entire book for us to read, the manual to life, to everything, to marriage, relationships, to parenting. And he's trying to hand us all the knowledge that we need. And then sometimes we can reject that or just not listen to it. People are people. So keys of 1 Kings, the key verse there, this is from Holman's Bible handbook, but the key verse in 1 Kings is chapter 11, verses 35 and 36, which says, I'll take 10 tribes of the kingdom from his son's hand and give them to you. I will give 1 tribe to his sons, that my servant David will always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem. And I think this is really cool, because even in the midst of all the history that's taking place, all the violence, all the corruption, you still see God's plan is just weaving its way all the way through history. And this was a really cool study for me personally, because I got to make this little timeline and see all this history kind of collapse down into one little PowerPoint slide, but then see how all of that leads up to Jesus. And so I'm sure you've heard the old saying, no matter what you read in the Bible, you can always find that connection to Jesus. And it's no different in the Kings. You can read through even the worst of times. God's still working. He's still working towards that Messiah, the greatest king since David. The King of Kings is going to show up. And all of this was in the mind of God from the very beginning. So you've got the key term there is division throughout 1 Kings, division. So that's what that happens after Solomon, is everything just splits. And once they split up, then things go really bad for one, with all the kings being wicked, and then one goes pretty much bad for that remnant tribe. So you get into 2 Kings, and 2 Kings is action-packed. It has, you have the fiery chariot with Elijah. Elisha takes over after that. But you have the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, and then some reformers that you have. So 2 Kings, you've got some more optimism and highlights there with Hezekiah and Josiah. They restore the worship of Yahweh, God, and they try and fight against idolatry. And then sadly, you see that this valiant effort that they put forth was still not enough. And so you can have these righteous kings that come in and try and do and reform, but really it's up to the individual, it's up to the person to change. No leader is going to change your heart for you, but this is something that has to be done on a personal level. But then God sets up someone like Hezekiah in a situation that's so bad and it's so corrupt, and there's a lot of fear, remember, because the Assyrians are about to overtake Jerusalem. But even in the midst of that, how do you remain faithful, and what do you do in circumstances like that? When the world around you is completely wicked, what do you do? And then you have Hezekiah, of course, praying the law up to God, and then constantly going into prayer, and then constantly pressing for those reforms to try and get back to how God wanted things to be, back to the original plan, because he got it. Our plan's not working out very well. God's plan was right from the very beginning, so let's just go back to that plan. And he was on to something with that. But there was just so much corruption that what we do in life really matters, because it can affect future generations. Both you could think about that in terms of the church, but also, of course, in parenting. What you do, what you decide is going to affect possibly generations down the line, for good or for bad. And then you have, of course, the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah. So 2 Kings on one slide before we get into the application points here. 2 Kings on a slide, you have the key verses is chapter 17, verses 22 through, it says 22 to 2. I think it should be 2 to 22. But basically this is the key section. The Israelites persisted in all their sins and did not turn away from them. And then finally the Lord removed Israel from his presence. And you've got this summary passage that where basically just has all that history condensed into one. And so it might look like God is not very patient until you expand that out and look at all the different kings. But the Israelites, they persisted, and then they didn't turn away. They refused to do that, and so the Lord removed them from his presence, which is what God still does today. Even though we're separated by all of these years, we still serve the same God. If you persist in sin, then you leave the presence of the Lord. You step outside the boundaries of grace. You step outside the light, and then you are no longer in the presence of God. And it's a very scary place to be, even looking back at Cain, where he chose to leave the presence of the Lord. If you remember in Genesis chapter 4, that was a choice. He chose to leave, and it's the same thing with the people of Israel. They chose. It wasn't that God said, I'm done with these people, I'm out of here. It was that they chose to pursue idolatry. They chose to pursue sin, and because of that, after so many years, God just said, all right, well, if that's the way that you want it to be, then I'm going to go ahead and allow you to do that. So key term is dispersion. One sentence summary: even after Elisha's ministry, Israel persisted in idolatry and went into captivity, but Judah, despite the prophets, continued to be so wicked that God sent Nebuchadnezzar to remove them from Babylon. And this was really the hardest concept or aspect of the 2 Kings to get my mind around, was after seeing the northern kingdom, after seeing what happened to them, why on earth would you just keep on pursuing sin and keep on pursuing idolatry when you had the chance to basically watch your sister nation, which split because of evil? But after watching that happen, 10 are gone. 10 are gone. There's 2 left. And then why would they go, I have a plan. Let's just keep doing things the way that we've been doing them, and then hopefully things will get better. It makes no sense. And in fact, it seems a little bit insane when you read about that. But why do people do that? Because I think we can make some application for us today too. But why would you think they would do that? You've got Assyria that knocked out those other 10, and then you've got Babylon coming. But why not change even then? Just to preserve yourself.
We say it won't happen to me. I'm different, I'm special. So
Yep. It's definitely easy to think that these consequences will not happen to me. It'll just happen to somebody else. Or maybe you're just thinking like, well, we're not that bad. We might be bad, but we're not that bad. And sometimes we might do that too, make some comparisons and go, well, I might be bad, but I'm not as bad as some. And so those things won't happen. I won't be lost. Surely I won't be lost because I'm not as bad as, a murderer. We always go there first, just to the extreme. I didn't kill anybody, so I'm okay. But yeah, it does seem a little bit strange. Something about the atmosphere, something about where they were at, so entrenched in sin and wickedness. It was almost like they couldn't find their way out of it, that it had gone on so long that they just could not do it, or at least they couldn't do it for any period of time. That would help this. But so you learn from both of those nations that split. Okay, so I want to get to really what I was excited about when I was prepping this class in the beginning, but just 10 lessons from the kings that we can learn. Number one, from Solomon, wisdom is a gift, but obedience is what sustains it. So that you can know the right thing to do. It's not like you didn't have the mouthpieces of God with the people pretty much the whole time. You had prophets saying, y'all aren't doing this right, you need to change some things, you need to get back on track. They could have that knowledge of what they're supposed to do, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what we choose to do with that knowledge. We can listen to that and decide to obey it or not, and God still operates the same today. So wisdom is a gift, but obedience sustains it. Number two, knowledge alone isn't enough. It has to be paired with faithfulness. Kind of in that same vein there, just knowing what to do is not enough, but we have to pair that with faithfulness and then do it continually. We're not going to fix it in one king, one reign of one king, but it has to be something that's continual for there to be any kind of change or reform. Yes, ma'am. Do you know that one off the top of your head? I believe it's Hosea 4:6. If knowledge serves me here. Hosea 4:6. Thanks, Dad. Yeah, that's exactly it, though. It's a lack of knowledge. And the sad, especially with Solomon, the sad part is he had it. I mean, he had more knowledge than anybody, and he just chose not to do it because, women and his own personal decision there. Number three, power without humility leads to ruin. Now, this was a theme that ran through all of them. It just seemed like the kings, starting with Saul, once they got a taste of what it was like to be a king, and pride crept in, it ended up being their ruin and their downfall. And so you have all those reminders as well. Power with humility, without humility, leads to ruin. Number four, God raises up prophets to speak truth and power. God still does that today, so God still is trying to communicate with his people at all times, and so are we communicating with him, and are we listening when he's speaking? That's just a major one. It applies to all the kings, and we only have 8 that end up listening to that. But God is still trying to reach out. He's still trying to speak. He hasn't just spun the world and stepped back and just said, good luck. But God is trying to guide us through. And so our relationship with him, we're called his children. He is our Father. And so listening to our Father is always going to be the best thing to do, especially since we have one that is all-knowing. Number 5, temporary reforms don't last without heart change. Now I can't remember which passage it was. I believe it's in Hosea, where God is upset with the sacrifices of the people because they're doing everything right. I mean, they're going through the ritual of the sacrifice, but then their offerings still they stank because their heart wasn't in it. And so having our heart in worship, having our heart in our service to God really matters. God doesn't care so much about the ritual. He doesn't care about just doing the right things and robotically doing the actions, but our heart has to change with it. Next, 6, faith often means standing alone. Now, we see this a lot in a king like Hezekiah, and I know we're mainly talking about the kings here, but you have the same that you see even in Elijah when he's up on Mount Carmel, where he's the only one. He's surrounded by prophets of Baal and the Ashtoreth, and he's outnumbered by a lot, and yet he still chose and made the decision to stand with God and not with them. So faith often means standing alone. And so what lessons did y'all pull out? Because I know there was a lot of great classes before mine, but what things have you pulled out? How do you stand against an entire world or an entire group of people that may not agree with God's plan or what God's trying to tell us? What are some ways to remain faithful and stay focused? Yeah. And I believe it started like that with Josiah, where the law was forgotten about, and then, he kind of finds it, dusts it off, and is like, what is this? And then opens it up and then discovers that this is God's law. And then as soon as he started reading those things, that's when you saw that change in his life. Then Hezekiah, same way, already brought up where he takes God's law and then he just lays it out before the Lord, and he's just trying, like, this is the plan, this is the way forward, and then just ignoring all other. Any counsel that points you away from God, ignore it and just go back to God's law. Yeah, I think we have to know what God says in the first place, what he expects of us, and also getting to know that God. There's all of those other gods that are around that are constantly pulling at the different kings to worship these other gods, these false gods, pagan gods. They're constantly pulling, and for some reason they decide to go that direction instead of worshiping the true God. And I think that relationship with him definitely matters. If we don't know who the God of heaven is, if we don't know who our God is, we're not going to be very motivated to serve that God, or we'll just have an unhealthy fear of that God instead of he wants what's best for us. He's looking out for us. He's not an evil tyrant. That's a God worth listening to and falling in love with. Okay. Number 7, we've touched on this a little bit, but God is patient, but judgment comes. God is very patient. He's a very patient Father, but if we keep doing the wrong thing, if we keep choosing to sin and go in the direction opposite of him, then that judgment is going to come. Number 8, a nation is only as strong as its leaders' characters. And then you can swap nation with the church. Same thing there. The church will never outgrow the shadow of the eldership. I've heard that phrase multiple times growing up. And I think we're very blessed here to have some very solid elders. And I love being able to say that now that we're members here. Some very great elders here, some of the best I've ever met. But the church is only going to be as strong as its leaders. You've got corrupt kings that brought about the instability, the war, the conquest. So leadership is rooted in justice, righteousness, and that's what's going to sustain the people. If the leaders are in the book, then they're going to try and lead by the book and hopefully influence and sway the people that are under their command. Number 9, even in judgment, God leaves hope. Now, after one, we already talked about the northern tribe. After the northern tribe gets wiped out, they get taken into captivity. And then you've got Judah, and things are looking really bad by the end of 2 Kings. You're like, man, there's Babylon. Now what happens? And it's rough. There's the Babylonian, the years of captivity are really rough, but God still has that line of hope, even in these books that are all about judgment. If you read like Habakkuk, you read through all these different, the woes to all the nations and the woe to Israel. Even at the end of that, there's always this hope. But God will raise up. God will save. God will offer salvation. So even in that judgment, you still see the love of God that shines right through, and he leaves us hope. And number 10, and most importantly, God's kingdom is greater than all earthly kingdoms. I don't know about you. I've pulled back a little bit from the news lately, just a personal decision. Everything was just negative. I don't know what news you're watching, but I don't ever see any news stories that are like, today we're going to talk about this golden retriever puppy that, saved an orphan from getting hit by a bus. There's never any good heartwarming story. It's always just terrible, and it's just this person's corrupt and this person needs to be thrown in jail, and here's war, it's about to go on, and it can be very, very negative. And so it can be easy to get sucked into that and become sort of a pessimist or become bitter. But I think this really helps us to refocus and say, no, thank goodness that America is not God's kingdom, and it's not the one that's going to last forever. This world is not our home. No matter who's in charge, no matter how good it gets here, it's never going to be greater than God's kingdom. And also kind of shifts the perspective. When we think about God's kingdom here on earth, are we reflecting God's kingdom in heaven? Are we reflecting those things that God wants us to do? And then pushing forward to that and letting that be our end goal is God's kingdom that is still yet to come. So don't put ultimate trust in political rulers. God's kingdom is the one that endures. Did I time that perfectly, or is that 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Oh, all right. Well, I'll open it up to y'all. Any lessons that, in particular, that stood out to y'all?
Well, the downfall of all of it, like you said, he never meant for there to be a king. And everybody wanted to be like everyone around him, but we're called to be different. So when you get it in your head, I don't have to look like all these people. I don't have to do what everyone else is doing. I'm supposed to be different and be okay with that.
Yeah, perhaps being a strange people is a good thing that God's looking out for us. You don't want to go and be like where everyone else is going and what they're acting like. You don't want it. You know, it might seem like we do, but yeah, we don't. Very good. Yeah, no, I always think that was so ridiculous that they wanted to have a king just like everybody else. It's like, why? You know, they've seen God do some very incredible things. Why would they want one person to rule over them, and then, you know, we put it on one person to make the decisions for the entire nation? Doesn't make any sense. And when you have the God of heaven, who's omniscient and he's omnipresent, why not have that God lead you instead of one flawed person? Yeah. Any others?
I think it also shows us that no matter who our family was, no matter who we descended from, no matter how much God loves us or our family, we all have a choice to be good or bad. We carry that out, change generations. He gives us that choice. He loves us. He wants us to do right. But we all have to decide for ourselves how we're going to live.
Yeah, and that's a really hard truth to swallow, because I'm like, nope, I'm going to force Jude, my son, I'm going to force him to be a righteous Christian. He's going to be a very faithful Christian. I will will it to happen. I will do it perfectly, and then he'll be faithful his entire life. But yeah, it doesn't always work out that way. But we do have he has the statistics for us. If you raise them in the way that they should go, if you try and train them up in the way that they should go, then statistically, they're going to turn out better than if you're just not trying at all. And also kind of humbling, because you can be an incredibly good and righteous parent, and that doesn't mean that it's going to translate over to your kids. So, yeah. Any others? All right. Oh.
I think it's interesting how even after Israel made it out of bondage, slavery of Israel, they keep looking back to elements of what they had there, ruler, stuff like that. I think they have their eyes on everybody, but they keep looking back to where they once were. For some reason, it's like they keep wanting to go back there.
Yeah, it's so easy to groan, because they did from the very beginning when they got out of Egyptian bondage. They were like, man, we had it good in Egypt. And it's like, it's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. Who says that, you know? After getting, miraculously saved by God, then turn around and be like, man, we had it good when we were slaves. It is very ridiculous, and it puts it into a good perspective.
Yeah, it's kind of like they have this mentality that the grass is always greener. Well, it's better off when we were over here in slavery. It's better we could have a king. Why can't we be like everybody else? So I think that's a good lesson to us, because we look through example and we think, how could we think that?
Yeah.
And think the grass is always greener like these other groups, or when you were in bondage. But we can do that very easily today. There's a lot less things that are that we look at. The grass is greener over here. If I go to this place, if I just involved in this one thing, it's not that drastic a change like what they were wanting. It's easier for us to fall in today.
Yeah, definitely.
I think part of the reason why they were asking for a king is you got to figure that they were getting tired of the cycle of judges as is presented in that book. They get oppressed, and then God raises up a judge for them, and then they, are delivered from their oppressors, and they follow the Lord. But then that judge dies, and then they start going back into idolatry. Then they're oppressed again, and it just keeps on going on over and over and over. But they learned the wrong lesson. If they had learned that you just need to keep on following the Lord, then they would have broken that cycle. Instead, they think, well, maybe the reason why we keep on getting oppressed is because we don't have a king like these other nations. We want to be like them.
Yeah. Which is understandable. I guess when you get into Samson, the most unconventional ruler of a people at the time, it's like, we don't have a king. We have that guy with the jawbone over there, you know, so it's a little, it's different, definitely strange, but yeah. I think that there's definitely a lot of, it makes sense if you were there, just for us today. You know, we kind of justify some things, but thank y'all so much. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the study and appreciate all the comments as well.